Hello and welcome. Today, we'll explore the power of storytelling to boost your English listening and speaking skills. Join me as we dive into the emotional journey of Selina, a tale of love, heartbreak, and resilience. Through her story, you'll practice understanding nuanced conversations, relatable emotions, and everyday vocabulary. Let's sharpen your English while unraveling lessons about trust, healing, and new beginnings. Press play, immerse yourself in Selina's world, and let's grow your language skills together. Part 1. Introduction and Story Setup. Hi, my name is Selina, and this is my story. 6 years ago, I met someone who would change my life in ways I could never have imagined. His name was Michael, and at the time, I thought he was the one. It all began on an ordinary afternoon in a small coffee shop downtown, my usual refuge after a busy day. I had my sketchbook open, doodling designs for a project I was working on. I was completely immersed, lost in the swirl of my thoughts, when suddenly, crash! My coffee spilled across the table, soaking my sketchbook. I looked up, startled and annoyed, only to see a man fumbling with napkins, his face a mixture of panic and embarrassment. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice genuine and almost pleading. I could have snapped at him. I wanted to. But there was something disarming about his awkward charm. "That sketchbook is ruined," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked at me with a sheepish grin and replied, "How about I buy you another coffee and try to make up for it?" Against my better judgment, I nodded. As we sat there waiting for the coffee, we started talking. His name was Michael, and he was an architect. We bonded over our shared love for design and creativity. His passion for his work was captivating, and he had a way of making me laugh despite the less than ideal first impression. By the end of that conversation, I didn't feel angry anymore. In fact, I felt intrigued. Our connection grew naturally from that day. What started as an accidental meeting turned into regular coffee dates, then long walks, and soon endless conversations that stretched into the night. Michael had a calm, steady presence that I found comforting, and I brought energy and spontaneity into his life. We balanced each other in a way that felt effortless. Within months, we were inseparable. Michael wasn't just thoughtful, he was deeply attentive. He remembered the smallest things about me, how I liked my coffee, the way I loved sunsets, and even my favorite artists. He made me feel seen and appreciated in ways I hadn't experienced before. It didn't take long for me to fall for him, completely and wholeheartedly. 2 years into our relationship, Michael proposed. It was the kind of moment I had only dreamed about. He planned everything down to the last detail. We were back at the coffee shop where we first met, sitting at the same table. He handed me a menu, and inside, he'd slipped a handwritten note. "Will you marry me?" I looked up, and there he was, down on one knee, holding a simple, elegant ring. I remember my heart racing as tears filled my eyes. "Yes," I whispered, and the entire cafe erupted into cheers. It was perfect, just like Michael. Our wedding a year later was everything I'd hoped for. Intimate, elegant, and filled with love. As I walked down the aisle, I couldn't stop smiling. Michael stood at the altar, looking at me like I was the only person in the world. We exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of our lives. In that moment, I felt invincible, as though nothing could ever break us apart. The early days of our marriage felt like a dream. We bought a cozy little house with a garden where I planted roses and daisies. Every morning we'd sit on the porch with our coffee, talking about our future. We planned vacations, dreamed of starting a family, and built a life that felt like a fairy tale. Michael and I had our quirks, of course. He was meticulously organized, and I was more spontaneous. But we complemented each other in ways that made me believe we were perfect together. Friends would often comment on how in sync we seemed, how our laughter and love filled any room we were in. For a long time, I believed that nothing could shake the foundation we had built. I was deeply in love, not just with Michael, but with the life we were creating together. I felt safe. I felt cherished. I felt like I had everything I had ever wanted. But life has a way of surprising you. Just when you think you've figured it all out, it throws you a curveball. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was to think that love alone was enough to weather any storm. But at that time, in those golden years of my marriage, I held on to the belief that we were unshakable. That was before the cracks began to show, before the late nights and the canceled plans, before the distance crept in, before I learned that even the most beautiful love stories can unravel. But for now, in these memories, I was happy. I was in love. And I thought it would last forever. Part 2. The Start of Conflict. When you're in love, it's easy to miss the warning signs, to brush off the little things that don't feel quite right. At first, I'd told myself everything was fine. After all, Michael and I had built a life together that felt perfect. or so I thought. But looking back now, I can see how the cracks in our marriage began to form, slowly and almost imperceptibly, until they became impossible to ignore. It started with small changes, the kind you can easily dismiss. Michael began working late more often. He'd come home looking exhausted, his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled, and head straight to the shower without saying much. I didn't think much of it at first. He was an architect, and his projects often required long hours and tight deadlines. I told myself that this was temporary, that he was just going through a busy season at work. But then the weekends started to change too. Michael, who once loved our lazy Saturday mornings and spontaneous road trips, began canceling our plans. "I'm just so tired," he'd say, rubbing his temples as he sat at the kitchen table. "I need to catch up on sleep." I wanted to believe him, so I let it go. Everyone gets overwhelmed sometimes, I reasoned. Maybe he just needed space to recharge. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He seemed distant, like his mind was always somewhere else. Our conversations, once so lively and full of laughter, became short and perfunctory. I'd ask him about his day, and his answers were vague. "It was fine," he'd say, barely looking up from his phone. The phone. Now that was another thing. Michael had always been glued to his phone, but lately it felt different. He started getting messages at odd hours, and he'd glance at the screen and quickly put it down, as if he didn't want me to see. When I asked him about it, he laughed and said, "It's just work stuff, Selina. You don't need to worry." I smiled and nodded, but inside, I couldn't help but wonder if he was hiding something. One night, about 6 months into this strange new rhythm, I decided to bring it up. We were sitting on the couch, watching a movie, though neither of us was really paying attention. I turned to him and said, "Michael, is everything okay? You've seemed distant lately." He looked at me, surprised, as if he hadn't noticed anything was wrong. "Of course everything's fine," he said, his tone light. "Why do you ask?" "It's just, you've been so busy with work, and we don't spend as much time together as we used to. I feel like we're drifting apart," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. Michael sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Selina, you're overthinking things. Work has been stressful, that's all. I promise, once this project is done, things will go back to normal." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was just a phase, that we would find our way back to each other. But deep down, A small, nagging voice in my head told me that something had shifted. I just didn't know what. As the weeks went on, Michael's behavior grew more erratic. He started coming home later and later, sometimes well past midnight. He'd mumble something about meetings running late or last-minute deadlines, but the explanations felt flimsy. When I suggested we plan a weekend getaway, just the two of us, he shook his head. I can't take time off right now. There's too much going on at work. I tried to be understanding. I really did. I cooked his favorite meals, planned quiet evenings at home, and even surprised him with tickets to a concert I knew he'd love. But nothing seemed to make a difference. Michael would smile and thank me, but his mind was always somewhere else. It was like living with a stranger, a man who looked like my husband but felt like someone I barely knew. One evening, as we were eating dinner, I noticed something unusual. Michael's phone, which he usually kept close, was sitting on the counter, buzzing repeatedly with notifications. "Aren't you going to check that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He glanced at it and shook his head. "It's just work emails," he said, but his tone was clipped, almost defensive. I let it go, but my unease grew. The turning point came a few weeks later. I was cleaning the house when I found a receipt crumpled in Michael's jacket pocket. It was from a fancy restaurant, one we'd never been to together. My heart sank as I stared at it, questions swirling in my mind. Who had he been with? Why hadn't he told me about it? That evening, I confronted him. "Michael, I found this in your jacket," I said, holding up the receipt. "Were you at this restaurant recently?" His face froze for a moment before he quickly recovered. "It was just a business dinner," he said, brushing it off. "Nothing to worry about." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I didn't think it was a big deal," he replied, his tone dismissive. "You're overreacting, Selina." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that there was a reasonable explanation for everything. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was keeping something from me. It was like there was a wall between us, one that I didn't know how to break down, and so the distance between us grew. We still lived in the same house, but emotionally, we were miles apart. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had gone wrong. How had we gone from being so in love to this? I didn't have the answers, and Michael wasn't giving them to me. I told myself it was just a rough patch, that every couple goes through ups and downs, but the cracks in our marriage were no longer small or subtle. They were widening, threatening to break us apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. Part 3. Discovering the Truth. Looking back, I think I always knew something was wrong. Deep down, I could feel it, like a splinter lodged in my heart, small but impossible to ignore. I kept telling myself I was overthinking, that I was just being paranoid. But as time went on, the unease grew until it was impossible to push aside. It started with his phone. Michael had always been attached to his phone, but now it felt different. He was secretive. He'd take his phone with him everywhere, into the bathroom, into the garden, even when he was just grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen. He started turning it face down on the table and keeping it on silent. Late at night, I'd catch him scrolling through messages, his face lit up by the glow of the screen, his expression unreadable. "Who's texting you this late?" I asked one night, trying to sound casual. "It's work," he said quickly, not looking up. "Just a client needing last-minute changes." I wanted to believe him, so I did. I nodded, turned off my bedside lamp, and pretended to fall asleep. But I couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that he wasn't telling me the whole truth. Then there were the lies. Small, almost insignificant ones. But they piled up like pebbles until they formed a mountain. He'd tell me he had to work late. But when I called his office to leave a message, the receptionist would say he had left hours ago. He'd say he was meeting friends, but when I asked who, his answers were vague, evasive. One evening, I decided to surprise him at work. I thought maybe we could grab dinner together, try to reconnect. I bought his favorite takeout and drove to his office. But when I got there, the building was dark. His car wasn't in the parking lot. Confused, I called his phone. He answered. On the third ring, his voice rushed. "Hey, Selina," he said. "I'm still at the office. Can I call you back?" I froze, gripping the steering wheel. "I'm outside your office," I said quietly. "Where are you really?" There was a long pause. Then he sighed. "I'm at a client meeting," he said, his tone defensive. "I didn't want to bother you with the details." My stomach churned. "Michael, why are you lying to me?" I whispered. "I'm not lying," he snapped. "I told you it's work. Why don't you trust me?" I didn't have an answer for him. I hung up and drove home, tears blurring my vision. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. A week later, the truth revealed itself in the most unexpected way. Michael had left his phone on the kitchen counter, something he never did anymore. It buzzed repeatedly with notifications, and curiosity got the better of me. I know I shouldn't have done it. I know it was a breach of his privacy. But in that moment, I felt like I had no other choice. I unlocked his phone and opened the messages. That's when I saw them. Texts from a name I didn't recognize. Victoria. My hands shook as I scrolled through the thread. The messages weren't about work. They were personal, intimate. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again? I miss you. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a drum. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I read further, each message cutting deeper than the last. There were photos, selfies of them together, smiling, laughing. There was a picture of Michael holding her hand across a candlelit table. The timestamp was from the night he told me he was working late. I felt like the ground beneath me had shattered. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed in, came crumbling down in an instant. This man, the man I had built my life with, had betrayed me. When Michael came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room. My hands were clenched into fists, the phone still in my lap. He walked in, his face lighting up briefly when he saw me, but his smile faded when he noticed my expression. "Selina? What's wrong?" he asked, setting his bag down. I didn't say anything. I just held up his phone, the messages with Victoria still open. His face went pale. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it, but then his shoulders slumped and he let out a heavy sigh. "I can explain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Explain?" I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. "Explain what, Michael? That you've been lying to me? That you've been cheating on me? Do you even understand what you've done?" He ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. It just did." I stared at him in disbelief. "It just did? That's your excuse? You didn't mean to hurt me, but you did it anyway?" Michael tried to explain, stumbling over his words, but I couldn't listen. Every word felt like a dagger, twisting the knife deeper into my heart. Finally, I cut him off. "Why, Michael?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would you do this to us? To me?" He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but I couldn't hear it. I was too consumed by the overwhelming pain, the betrayal, the sense that my entire world had been turned upside down. That night, I cried myself to sleep in the guest room. Michael tried to talk to me, to apologize, but I couldn't bear to look at him. The man I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a stranger who had shattered my trust, my heart, and everything we had built together. For days after, I felt like I was living in a nightmare. The house, once filled with love and laughter, now felt cold and empty. Everywhere I turned, I saw reminders of the life we used to have, photos of us smiling, the notes he used to leave me, the plans we'd made for the future. And all of it felt like a lie. The truth was out, and there was no going back. My marriage was broken, and for the first time, I didn't know if it could be saved. Part 4: The Aftermath of the Breakup. When the truth about Michael's affair came out, it felt as though my entire world had collapsed. The home we had built together, the life I thought was unshakable, suddenly felt like an empty shell. The betrayal was too deep, the hurt too raw, and I knew that nothing could ever be the same again. For the first few days after the confrontation, the house was eerily quiet. Michael tried to reach out, but I couldn't even look at him. Every time he spoke, his words felt hollow, like echoes bouncing off walls that used to hold love and trust. I moved into the guest room, needing space to think, though I wasn't sure what there was to think about. My mind was a tangled mess of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. He tried to apologize, of course. "I never meant to hurt you, Selina," he said one night, his voice trembling. "I made a terrible mistake. I don't even know why I did it. I was lost, confused. But I still love you." Love. The word sounded foreign coming from him now. How could he claim to love me after everything he'd done? His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could, and they told a story of betrayal and deceit. "I can't do this, Michael," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I can't pretend like everything's okay. You didn't just break my heart. You broke us." After that, I stopped engaging with him altogether. We lived in the same house, but felt like strangers. The silence was suffocating, but it was better than the alternative, facing him, hearing his excuses, reliving the pain. Deciding to leave. One evening, as I sat alone in the guest room, I realized that staying in the house was tearing me apart. Every corner of it was filled with memories. The photos of us on the walls, the souvenirs from trips we'd taken, the coffee mugs we used to share every morning. It was unbearable. I knew that if I stayed, I would drown in the weight of what had happened. The next day, I told Michael I was leaving. He looked at me with a mixture of shock and desperation. "Selina, please," he said, reaching for my hand. "We can work through this. We can go to counseling, rebuild what we've lost." I shook my head, pulling my hand away. "Michael, I can't rebuild something that's already been destroyed. You made a choice, and now I have to make mine." Packing my things was one of the hardest things I've ever done. As I folded clothes and boxed up my belongings, I couldn't stop the memories from flooding in. The sweater I wore on our first date, the photo album we made together after our honeymoon. It all felt like pieces of a life that no longer existed. By the time I walked out the door, I felt like I had left a part of myself behind. The woman who had walked into that house as Michael's wife was gone, replaced by someone who didn't yet know who she was or where she was going. Starting over. I moved into a small apartment across town, far enough to feel like I was starting fresh, but not so far that I had to uproot my entire life. The space was modest, just a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area. But it was mine. It was a blank slate, a place where I could begin to rebuild. The first few weeks were the hardest. The silence in the apartment was deafening, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. I spent most nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the past few months in my head. What had I missed? How had I let things get so far without noticing? Was there something wrong with me that had pushed Michael into someone else's arms? Those questions haunted me. They followed me into every quiet moment, every pause in my day. I couldn't escape them. I tried throwing myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the pain was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Friends and family reached out, offering support, but I struggled to let them in. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate their kindness. It was just that talking about what had happened felt like reopening a wound that was already bleeding. I wasn't ready to share my pain with anyone else. It felt too personal, too raw. The loneliness. The loneliness was the worst part. For years, I had shared my life with Michael. I had someone to talk to, laugh with, and plan a future with. Now, I was alone, and the absence of those things felt like a void I didn't know how to fill. I missed the small things, having someone to share my day with, waking up to the sound of another person breathing beside me. Even the arguments, as painful as they had been, were better than this deafening silence. I found myself replaying our memories, both the good and the bad, like a movie on repeat. I remembered the way Michael used to look at me when we were first dating, the way he held my hand on our wedding day, the nights we spent dreaming about our future. And then I remembered the lies, the distance, the betrayal. The memories clashed together, leaving me confused and heartbroken. The first steps forward. Eventually, I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't let the pain consume me. I had to start moving forward, even if it felt impossible. So, I took small steps. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts and feelings onto the page in a desperate attempt to make sense of them. I went for long walks, letting the fresh air and the rhythm of my footsteps calm my restless mind. I also started therapy. It wasn't an easy decision. I didn't like the idea of opening up to a stranger about my deepest wounds, but I knew I needed help. My therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, encouraged me to stop blaming myself for Michael's choices. What he did was about him, not about you, she said during one session. You are not responsible for his actions. Her words were a lifeline, a small but steady reminder that I wasn't broken or unworthy. I was simply human, doing my best to navigate a heartbreak I hadn't asked for, reclaiming myself. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel the tiniest flickers of hope. I rediscovered hobbies I had neglected during my marriage: painting, reading, exploring new coffee shops. I reconnected with old friends who reminded me of the person I had been before Michael, a person who was vibrant and full of life. Slowly, but surely, I started to feel like myself again. But it wasn't easy. There were still days when the sadness crept in, when I missed the life I thought I would have with Michael. On those days, I allowed myself to grieve, to sit with the pain without letting it define me. I reminded myself that healing isn't a straight line, and that it was okay to have bad days as long as I kept moving forward. Leaving Michael wasn't the end of my story. It was the end of a chapter, one filled with love, betrayal, and heartbreak. But as I stood in my little apartment, surrounded by the beginnings of a new life, I realized something important. I had survived. And for the first time in a long time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could thrive again. Part 5. The Journey of Healing and Self-Rediscovery. Healing isn't a straight road. It's a winding, uneven path filled with highs and lows, moments of hope and stretches of despair. For me, the journey began not with a grand revelation, but with small, tentative steps, tiny acts of reclaiming myself from the ashes of heartbreak. In the early days after leaving Michael, I felt like a shadow of the person I used to be. My confidence was shattered, and my sense of identity had been so tied to our life together that I wasn't sure who I was without him. I had been Michael's wife, a title I wore proudly, but now that title was gone, and I felt adrift. Creating space to heal. The first step was creating a space where I could begin to heal. My new apartment became my sanctuary, a blank slate that allowed me to build a life that was mine and mine alone. I spent days arranging and rearranging furniture, hanging art on the walls, and filling the space with things that brought me joy. Books I'd always wanted to read, plants that I lovingly tended to, and a cozy corner where I could sit and think. At first, I dreaded coming home to the silence. But over time, I started to find comfort in it. The quiet gave me room to reflect, to process everything that had happened. I began journaling every night, pouring my thoughts and feelings onto the page. It became a ritual, a way to release the emotions that felt too big to carry, therapy and letting go of guilt. Starting therapy was one of the hardest decisions I made, but also one of the most transformative. My therapist, Dr. Patel, was patient and understanding, guiding me gently through the tangled mess of emotions I was carrying. I struggled with guilt for not seeing the signs, guilt for not being able to save my marriage, and even guilt for leaving Michael. "Selina," she said during one session, her voice calm but firm, "you are not responsible for his choices. You gave your best to that relationship. His betrayal is not a reflection of your worth, but of his inability to value what he had." Her words struck a chord deep within me. For so long, I had internalized the blame, thinking that if I had been better, more attentive, more supportive, more anything, maybe things would have been different. But slowly, I began to understand that Michael's actions were not about me. They were about him and his failure to honor the commitment we had made, reconnecting with myself. With that realization came a sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to focus on me, not as a wife or a partner, but as an individual. I dusted off my old sketchbooks and started drawing again. Art had always been my passion, but somewhere along the way I had stopped making time for it. Now it became my therapy. I'd lose myself for hours in the swirl of colors and lines, pouring my emotions onto the canvas. I also started exploring the city again, something I hadn't done in years. On weekends, I'd wander through art galleries, visit farmers markets, and discover hidden coffee shops. At first, it felt strange to do these things alone, but gradually, I began to enjoy my own company. There was a quiet strength in reclaiming these moments for myself, in realizing that I didn't need anyone else to make my life meaningful. Rebuilding relationships. Part of my healing journey was reconnecting with the people I had unintentionally distanced myself from during my marriage. My best friend Clara had been my rock during the breakup, and now she became my partner in crime for all kinds of adventures. She reminded me of the person I used to be, the Selina who was vibrant, spontaneous, and unafraid to chase her dreams. We started taking yoga classes together, something Clara had been trying to convince me to do for years. At first, I was skeptical. I wasn't sure how stretching and breathing could possibly help me feel better. But over time, yoga became another form of therapy, a way to quiet my mind and reconnect with my body. With every session, I felt a little stronger, a little more in control. I also reconnected with my family, who had been quietly supportive throughout everything. My mom, in particular, became a source of wisdom and comfort. "You're stronger than you think, Selina," she told me one afternoon as we sat in her garden sipping tea. "This pain will pass, and when it does, you'll see how much you've grown." Embracing new experiences. As the months went by, I started to embrace new experiences. I signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. I wasn't great at it, but it didn't matter. It was fun, and it reminded me that life was about trying new things, even if you weren't perfect at them. One day, during a photography outing in the park, I struck up a conversation with a fellow student named Ethan. He was easygoing, with a warm smile and a dry sense of humor that made me laugh in a way I hadn't in months. We started meeting up for coffee after class, talking about everything from art to life's unexpected twists. For the first time since my marriage ended, I felt a connection with someone, a spark of something I wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. Learning to forgive. A crucial part of my healing journey was learning to forgive. Not just Michael, but myself. Forgiving Michael didn't mean excusing what he had done or letting him back into my life. It meant letting go of the anger and resentment that had been weighing me down. I realized that holding on to those feelings was only hurting me, not him. Forgiving myself was harder. I had to let go of the guilt, the self-doubt, and the belief that I wasn't enough. It was a gradual process, one that required patience and compassion. But with each passing day, I felt a little lighter, a little more whole. Finding strength. As I looked back on the months following the breakup, I saw how far I had come. I wasn't the same person who had walked out of that house, broken and unsure of herself. I was stronger, more resilient, and more in tune with who I was and what I wanted from life. Healing wasn't linear, and there were still days when the pain resurfaced. But those days became fewer and farther between. I learned to give myself grace, to celebrate the progress I had made, and to look forward to the future with hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. My journey of healing and self-rediscovery wasn't over, but I was no longer afraid of the road ahead. I had found my footing, and I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it. Part 6. The relationship with Ethan. I wasn't looking for love, not after what had happened with Michael. I told myself I needed time to heal, to rebuild my life, to figure out who I was without the weight of heartbreak dragging me down. So when I first met Ethan, I didn't think much of it. He was just another student in the photography class I had signed up for, a friendly face among strangers. Ethan was warm and approachable, with an easy smile that put people at ease. He had this quiet confidence about him, like he was comfortable in his own skin. We bonded over our shared love for capturing the beauty of ordinary moments, sunlight filtering through leaves, the texture of an old brick wall, the fleeting expressions of people on the street. A simple beginning. Our first real conversation happened after class one afternoon. We had both lingered behind, taking extra shots of a particularly beautiful old fountain in the park. He noticed me struggling with my camera settings and offered to help. "Here," he said, stepping closer and gently adjusting the dials on my camera. "You just need to lower the ISO a bit. The light's better now." I looked at him, a little surprised. "Thanks. I'm still figuring all this out." "We all start somewhere," he said with a shrug. "The important thing is that you're here, trying. That's more than most people do." His words stuck with me. There was something about the way he spoke, genuine, without a hint of judgment, that made me feel seen. We ended up walking to a nearby cafe and talking for hours. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on everything from our favorite books to the quirks of city life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt comfortable with someone. I didn't have to put up walls or pretend to be okay when I wasn't. Slowly building trust. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and I started spending more time together. It wasn't anything official, just coffee after class, walks in the park, and the occasional text exchange about a particularly great photo we'd taken. He never pushed for more, never tried to rush me into anything. He seemed to understand that I was still healing, still finding my way. Ethan was patient, and that patience became a cornerstone of our growing connection. He didn't pry into my past, though I could tell he was curious. Instead, he let me share pieces of my story at my own pace. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, I found myself opening up about Michael. I was married, I said, my voice quiet. It ended badly. He wasn't faithful. Ethan didn't react with shock or pity. He just nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said after a moment. "That must have been really hard." "It was," I admitted, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "I'm still figuring out how to move on." "You don't have to rush," he said gently. "Healing takes time." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of understanding that I hadn't expected. In that moment, I realized how rare it was to feel truly understood by someone, a spark of something new. As the weeks turned into months, my feelings for Ethan began to grow. It wasn't the all-consuming whirlwind kind of love I had experienced with Michael. This was different, slower, steadier, and deeply rooted in mutual respect and understanding. With Ethan, there was no pressure, no sense of urgency. It felt safe. It felt real. One evening, after a long day of exploring the city with our cameras, Ethan walked me back to my apartment. We stood outside the door, lingering in the cool evening air, neither of us wanting to say goodbye just yet. "Selina," he said, his voice hesitant, "I really enjoy spending time with you. I hope you know that." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "I enjoy spending time with you too, Ethan." He looked at me, his eyes soft and full of sincerity. "I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for. But if you're open to it, I'd like to see where this could go." I hesitated, not because I didn't want the same thing, but because I was afraid of getting hurt. Again, of opening my heart only to have it broken. But as I looked into Ethan's eyes, I saw a kindness and honesty that put my fears at ease. "I'd like that too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, learning to love again. Our relationship progressed slowly, but that was exactly what I needed. Ethan never pressured me to be anything other than who I was. He celebrated my small victories, like finishing a painting I'd been working on for weeks or finally getting the hang of a tricky photography technique. He listened when I needed to talk and gave me space when I needed to be alone. One of my favorite memories from those early days was a surprise picnic Ethan planned. He took me to a quiet spot by the river where he had set up a blanket and a basket filled with my favorite snacks. As we sat there, watching the water flow and laughing over stories from our childhoods, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Joy. Ethan had a way of bringing light into my life, of reminding me that there was still beauty and hope even after heartbreak. He didn't try to erase my past or fix me. Instead, he stood by me as I learned to navigate the scars it had left behind. Facing challenges together. Of course, it wasn't always easy. There were moments when my insecurities bubbled to the surface, when old fears threatened to overshadow the happiness we were building. One night, after a particularly bad day, I found myself pulling away, retreating into the walls I had spent so much time constructing. Ethan noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle, but concerned. "I'm just scared," I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. "What if this doesn't work? What if I get hurt again?" He took my hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "Selina, I can't promise that everything will be perfect, but what I can promise is that I'll always be honest with you. I'll never take your trust for granted." His words broke through the fog of doubt, and I realized that I didn't have to face my fears alone. With Ethan, I could take things one step at a time, knowing that he was there to catch me if I stumbled. A new chapter. As our relationship deepened, I began to see a future with Ethan, not as a replacement for the life I had lost, but as something entirely new and beautiful in its own right. We didn't rush into grand plans or declarations. Instead, we built our connection piece by piece, moment by moment. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly happy. Not because everything in my life was perfect, but because I was learning to embrace the imperfections. With Ethan by my side, I realized that love wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward, together, and creating something new. This was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one filled with hope, trust, and a love that felt like coming home. Part 7. Facing the past with Michael. I thought I had closed the chapter on Michael. I thought I had moved on, leaving the betrayal and heartbreak behind me. But life has a way of circling back to the things you think you've buried, forcing you to confront them when you least expect it. It had been over a year since I'd walked out of the house we once shared. I had spent those months rebuilding my life, finding myself again, and beginning something new with Ethan. I was in a better place, or so I thought, when a message from Michael disrupted the fragile peace I had worked so hard to create. The message, "It die," came as a text late one evening when I was sitting on the couch with Ethan. My phone buzzed and I glanced at the screen. The name on the message made my stomach tighten. Michael. Hi, Selina. It's been a while. I was wondering if we could meet up and talk. There's something I need to say. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. What could he possibly want after all this time? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message and pretend it never happened. But another part of me, the part still carrying a sliver of unresolved pain, was curious. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, noticing my reaction. I handed him the phone without a word. He read the message, his expression calm. "What do you want to do?" he asked, handing the phone back to me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't think I need to talk to him, but part of me wonders if it might help to finally get closure." Ethan nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'm here." His support meant everything to me, and after a few days of deliberation, I decided to meet Michael. Not because I needed closure from him, I had found that within myself, but because I wanted to close the door on that chapter of my life for good. The meeting. We agreed to meet at a small cafe, one we used to go to during the early days of our relationship. Walking in, I felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with a deep sense of unease. The place hadn't changed, but I had. I wasn't the same person who used to sit at these tables, dreaming of a future with Michael. He was already there. When I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him, he looked different, older, more tired. His hair was a little grayer at the temples, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he saw me, he stood up awkwardly, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Hi, Selina," he said, his voice tentative. "Hi, Michael," I replied, keeping my tone neutral as I sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, Michael cleared his throat and looked at me. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But I figured we both deserved a chance to say what needs to be said." He nodded, looking down at his coffee. "You're right. There's a lot I need to say. I've been carrying this guilt for a long time, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to apologize for everything." The apology. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I betrayed you, Selina. I broke your trust, and I broke us. There's no excuse for what I did. I was selfish, and I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand." His words were halting, but they felt genuine. For the first time, I saw the regret in his eyes, the weight of what he had done etched into his face. "I thought I was unhappy," he continued, his voice trembling. "I convinced myself that I deserved more, that I was missing out on something. But the truth is, I was the one who wasn't enough. You gave me everything, and I threw it away." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I didn't let myself cry. "Michael," I said quietly, "you didn't just betray me. You made me question everything, who I was, whether I was enough, whether I could ever trust anyone again." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "And I'm so sorry. I can't change what I did, but I needed you to know that I regret it every single day." Finding forgiveness. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "I needed to hear it, even if it's too late to change anything." He nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I don't expect anything from you, Selina. I just hope you've found happiness. You deserve that." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I realized I didn't feel anger toward him anymore. The pain was still there, a dull ache that would probably never fully go away. But the bitterness had faded. I had spent so long carrying the weight of what he had done, but in that moment, I felt a sense of release. "I have found happiness," I said, my voice steady. "And I hope you find it too, Michael. I really do." He looked at me, his expression a mixture of relief and sadness. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means more than you know." Closing the chapter. We talked for a little while longer, catching up on the basics of life, work, family, the usual small talk. But the conversation didn't linger on the past. There was no need to rehash old wounds. By the time we said goodbye, I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. As I walked back to my car, I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. Michael's betrayal had shattered me, but it had also forced me to grow, to rediscover myself, and to find a love that was real and honest with Ethan. Meeting with Michael hadn't reopened old wounds. It had allowed me to close them for good. When I got home, Ethan was waiting for me. He looked up from the book he was reading, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. "How did it go?" he asked. "It went well," I said, a sense of calm washing over me. "I think I can finally say goodbye to that part of my life." He smiled and pulled me into his arms. "I'm proud of you," he said. In that moment, I realized just how far I had come. Facing Michael wasn't about closure from him. It was about finding peace within myself. And as I sat there with Ethan, I knew that I had finally done just that. The past no longer defined me. I was free to move forward into a future filled with hope, love, and possibility. Part 8. Challenges and Triumphs in Love with Ethan. Ethan and I had built something special, something grounded in trust, understanding, and patience. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was with someone who truly saw me for who I was, scars and all. But life, as I had learned, has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. Our love was no exception. The calm before the storm. The first year of our relationship was filled with quiet joys and small victories. We took things slow, savoring each moment and allowing our connection to grow naturally. Ethan and I shared a love for the simple things: sunset walks in the park, lazy mornings with coffee and books, and weekend road trips to explore hidden corners of the countryside. He was everything I hadn't realized I needed: steady, kind, and unwaveringly supportive. He celebrated my progress and encouraged me to pursue my dreams. With him, I felt a sense of safety and belonging I hadn't thought possible after Michael. Life felt good, peaceful even. But peace, I learned, can be fragile. The unexpected news. It started with something small. Ethan mentioning he wasn't feeling well one evening. "Probably just a bug," he said, brushing it off as we sat on the couch. But the fatigue didn't go away, and over the next few weeks, other symptoms began to appear. He lost weight, his appetite diminished, and there were days when he seemed unusually pale. "Ethan, you need to see a doctor," I said one evening, worry evident in my voice. He smiled, trying to reassure me. "It's nothing, Selina. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. A few weeks later, after finally agreeing to a checkup, we got the news that changed everything. Ethan had cancer. I sat beside him in the sterile, cold doctor's office, the word echoing in my mind like a gong. Cancer. The doctor spoke in calm, measured tones, explaining the diagnosis, treatment options, and next steps. But I barely heard a word. All I could think about was Ethan. His warmth, his laugh, his gentle presence, and the terrifying possibility of losing him. The fight begins. Ethan faced the diagnosis with a quiet strength that amazed me. "We'll get through this," he said, his hand wrapped around mine as we left the hospital. Together. But as the treatments began, the reality of the situation set in. Chemotherapy drained him, robbing him of his energy and leaving him weak and nauseated. There were days when he could barely get out of bed, and nights when the pain was so intense it brought tears to his eyes. Watching him suffer was excruciating. I wanted so badly to take the burden from him, to make it all go away. But all I could do was be there. And so I was. I sat with him during chemo sessions, holding his hand as he dozed off under the fluorescent lights of the treatment room. I cooked meals he could barely eat, hoping that just a few bites would give him strength. I stayed up late into the night, researching ways to ease the side effects or help him feel more comfortable. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when the stress and fear felt overwhelming. I cried in the shower where he wouldn't hear me, and vented to my closest friend Clara about how helpless I felt. "You're stronger than you think," she told me one evening over the phone, "and so is Ethan. You'll get through this together." Strength in vulnerability. One night, after a particularly rough day, Ethan and I sat on the couch in silence. His head rested on my shoulder, and his hand was loosely clasped in mine. The room was dimly lit, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "Selina," he said softly, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry." "For what?" I asked, turning to look at him. "For putting you through this," he said, his voice trembling. "For being a burden." Tears welled up in my eyes and I shook my head. "Ethan, you're not a burden. You're my partner, and I love you. We're in this together, no matter what." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. "You make me believe I can get through this," he whispered. In that moment, I realized just how much we meant to each other. Love wasn't just about the good times. It was about standing together when things were hard, when life felt uncertain and terrifying. Small victories. As the weeks turned into months, there were moments of light amidst the darkness. Ethan's doctors were cautiously optimistic, and his treatment started to show signs of working. The days when he could barely move became less frequent, and he began to regain some of his strength. One afternoon, we took a short walk in the park near our apartment. It was the first time in weeks that Ethan had felt up to leaving the house. The autumn leaves crunched beneath our feet, and the crisp air felt like a balm on my worried heart. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a hint of the old Ethan, the man who had made me laugh, who had shown me what it meant to be loved. "We're going to get through this," he said, looking at me with that familiar determination. And for the first time, I believed him. A new beginning. After months of grueling treatment, the day we had been waiting for finally arrived. Ethan went in for his final round of tests, and the results were what we had prayed for: remission. The cancer was gone. We sat in the doctor's office, holding hands as the news sank in. Tears streamed down my face, and Ethan's grip on my hand tightened. "We did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we got back to the apartment, Ethan pulled me into his arms and held me tightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for staying with me, for believing in me." I pulled back and looked at him, my heart swelling with love. "We believed in each other," I said. "That's what got us through." Moving forward together. Life didn't immediately return to normal after Ethan's remission. The experience had changed us, leaving scars both physical and emotional. But it had also brought us closer, deepening our love in ways I hadn't thought possible. We learned to cherish the small moments, the quiet mornings, the laughter we shared, the simple act of being together. We didn't take anything for granted anymore, knowing how fragile life could be. One evening, as we sat on the porch of our home watching the sunset, Ethan turned to me with a smile. "You know," he said, "I think we've earned this." I laughed, leaning my head against his shoulder. "I think so too." In that moment, I realized that the challenges we had faced hadn't just tested our love, they had strengthened it. Together, we had faced the storm, and together, we had come out the other side. This was our triumph, and it was more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. Great work today! Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.